right. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the next Lift Academy virtual assembly. Couple things that we wanted to share with you today is, as a reminder, please put your name and affiliation in the chat box so we can get a good sense from across the board who's with us today. I also wanted to share, my name is Summer Gathercole. I'm the managing director of SHG Advisors, who is leading the Lift Academy. And one of the reasons we are so excited about today is because it is really the kickoff for our programmatic excellence pillar, which, we have spent the last couple of months really focused on the funding sustainability. And we've heard and learned a number of kind of great things about how to diversify funding, how to think about it differently, how to kind of get out of the traditional funding box, if you will, really led by Tanya Smith-Evans. And now we're going to move into programmatic excellence. So we're super excited. Okay, we want to talk about a few housekeeping items just to remind everyone, as you are entering the room, you're automatically muted, and that's just to ensure that we keep the background noise to a minimum. We definitely encourage you to ask questions. Feel free to put questions in the chat box. If you have a question that you just can't wait to ask, raise your hand. I mean, we want to make sure that we're responsive to kind of that moment where you really want to find something out. And then also as a reminder, this is being recorded. We will be posting this to the Lift Academy resource page within the next day or so. So in terms of our schedule today, of course, we've got our welcome. We're going to talk to you a little bit about kind of the things we want to dive into today around housing outcomes by program type, and then also an overview of HMIS dashboards. So at the end, we'll talk about a little bit about what's coming up next. And of course, we'll have a survey for you all to complete. But to kind of get into a little bit more of our objectives today, that reviewing of housing outcomes by project type using national data. So our team has spent some time kind of digging into kind of across different housing types of programs, kind of what are the benchmarks, what are some of those best practices, what are the evidence-driven strategies that we've seen work really well. So we'll hear that just as kind of setting the foundation. And then we're also joined by Matt Richard from the Ojai office, who recently got promoted to a new kind of statewide data position. So it's perfect timing to really start diving into HMIS and making sure that we are that our Lift Academy is aligned with kind of how Ojai is thinking about dashboards, how we're using them, and making sure that if there's more assistance that is needed, we can spend some time during those TA sessions doing that. So that's a little bit of what you're going to experience and find today. One last note that we wanted to make before kind of diving into a little bit more of the meat of the conversation is around the current or recent HUD COC NOFO. So for those of you who might be newer to the field, NOFO is Notice of Funding Opportunity. We know that the recent NOFO that has been released was a little bit surprising for folks. It might be creating some discomfort and some questions. So as we're talking about kind of programmatic excellence and outcomes, we also just want to acknowledge that this is might be a little bit of a difficult time for some people. We are here to work with you to kind of build diverse and resilient infrastructures, if you will. So we're here to work with you to get through these different transitions. If you have questions specifically around the NOFO, please reach out to your COC. They can help kind of guide you through any of those questions. We're here to just continue to help you stay focused on having the best housing programs that you can, regardless of where the funding is coming from and what that looks like. The good news, at least for those of us here in Colorado, is that the state government, our philanthropic funders and others are very committed to housing and addressing homelessness across the state. So it's really good to know, I think, that we have that support and strength behind the scenes a little bit. So with that, Cassie, I'm going to turn it over to you. I want to see, did I miss anything about talking about the NOFO?
No, that's great. I think we're all a little bit in the dark here on what's going to come, so we're just going to be in it together. So no, I appreciate that. Like Summer said, my name is Cassie Westmoreland. I am working with quite a few of you. If you haven't If we haven't met before, it's nice to meet you. I've been working all over Colorado on homelessness for about 10 years now, primarily, previously, excuse me, before coming to SHG Advisors, I was actually at the Office of Homeless Initiatives. So a little bit of overlap for me. Luckily, I get to continue to working with you all. But like Summer said, we are officially moving into our second pillar. So we've spent the last 4 months or so looking at financial sustainability. Now we're really moving into that program excellence. We'll probably be having program excellence curriculum through February, maybe early March of next year. And then we'll move into our third and final pillar, which we're calling intentional input. So just a little bit of a reminder of the LIFT framework, the pillars, where we are, what the future looks like. Colin, if you want to go to the next slide. Part of what we're going to start with today in terms of our program excellence is really looking at that data-driven improvement. And that's why we have Matt with us today. Thanks, Matt, for joining. Colorado has made a huge investment in really leveraging real-time data and data-driven improvement. And so we're going to start today looking at some national data, looking at how Colorado is trying to operationalize some national data, and then looking at the different ways that you can actually use data in your programming. I think for a while now, we've been moving away from subjective metrics and moving really into those objective metrics. And we're not saying that's the only way to do that, right? We're not saying that you shouldn't continue to collect resident stories and incorporate resident feedback and things like that into your programming. But this section is really, really going to focus on what are those data-driven improvements and how to use that throughout the programming. One of the main areas that we're going to focus on this is with Ojai's sort of methodology of making homelessness rare, brief, and non-recurring. So what does that look like? So for us, at a very high level, we know this is going to look really different across program types and across geographies. But at a high level, to make homelessness rare, we want to make sure that people are going to housing after they exit your homelessness program. We want to make it brief. How quickly are we able to get people back into housing? And then we want to make it non-recurring. Once we move people into housing, are they returning to homelessness services and systems? So those are the core areas that we're going to look at today. Like I said, we know this is going to be very different across program types, and Colin has done a lot of great research within those program types and is going to give us a sense of how much do we know in terms of these pieces across the program types across the nation versus what is still kind of unsure. There are some components of this where people aren't necessarily able to easily track if folks are falling back into homelessness, for example. So we're going to be candid and upfront about the data that we do have and how we're able to use that. And we're really going to try and move people sort of across these various levels of engagement with data. Looking at the first level, what we're calling sort of functional data, right? It's very manual. Maybe you're inputting data into a spreadsheet. You're getting the very specific metrics of what your funder needs, but maybe not looking at your whole program health. This sort of data collection is really high need driven, and it's a little incomplete in terms of being able to look at the full scope of your programming. I would say most of the folks that we're working with are probably here in this level two. Processes are standardized and we know what we're tracking. Data is a little more timely. It's a little more consistent, if you will. In this strategic section, we're really looking back at our data. So instead of using data in real time, we're kind of looking at our outcomes and seeing after programs end or after program years end if we were successful. And what we're hoping to really do with our Thor folks and the folks that we're providing TA to is to get them to this transformational incorporation of data. So not just looking back to see what happened, but really using data in real time to make tweaks, make changes, and improve those outcomes as we move forward. So we just want to sort of do a little bit of level setting there before we jump into some of our more deep research. So I'm going to pass it over to Colin.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. I am Colin Bildine. I am working with SHG Advisors. I'm providing TA to a number of organizations that are on the call today. But if I haven't met you yet, it's great to meet you all. And if you do know me at all, you'll know how absolutely geeked I am to be able to present some national level data in some of the research that we've compiled over the past several months. Before we sort of dive into the data, I wanted to do some level setting in terms of what are we looking at, how are these results selected, etc. So we really took a pretty broad approach to reviewing published academic studies around homelessness outcomes and these programs. And then when we weren't able to, we really tried to look at outcome reporting data by COCs, by large metropolitan areas, or really look at what is the best available evidence we can find. We're looking at a number of programs, including street outreach. I will say that we're really focused on the housing outcomes for street outreach, which may differ based upon what we see organizations sort of measure right now. We're not really looking at connections to care. We're really focused on those three questions that OHI focuses on is, are you moving people to housing? How quickly are you moving them to housing? And how are people returning to homelessness after receiving your services?
Hey,
Another level,
Colin,
yeah.
I apologize. I'm sorry to interrupt. We're getting a couple
Yeah.
of requests to see if you can speak a little bit louder.
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry. I know my microphone is not
Thank you.
always great at picking up my voice in Zoom. In terms of the studies we're looking at, we really try to prioritize the highest quality evidence we can look at. So starting with systematic reviews, which are studies of studies. So really looking at large data sets from varied geographies to sort of see what are the housing outcomes that high performing programs are achieving. When we couldn't get systematic reviews, we really wanted to look at large experimental design, so things like random control trials that will compare the outcomes of these housing interventions when compared to what is referred to as standard care or kind of status quo care, which would typically be what a client would go through. And finally, we tried to look at sort of studies with varied geographies. We know that there will be a lot of outcomes data for the larger metropolitan areas, places like New York City, Washington, D.C., very large cities that have a lot of resource and sort of large rental markets. But we were pretty intentional about trying to capture sort of a varied look at geography because we know homelessness is a very localized issue in terms of the factors that can sort of influence housing outcomes. So we tried to be mindful of that. I will close with this is intended to be informative. We're hoping that by presenting this information, you all can better understand what sort of high performing programs look like in this space, and also understanding that the data we're looking at coming from academic studies or high performing programs, these programs are very much on the transformational side of the data discussion. And also studies are typically much better resourced in terms of being able to track and secure quality data. So if this data is sort of shocking or sort of very different than what you see at your program, that's to be expected. What we're hoping to do is sort of present this data to sort of get some questions flowing in your mind of what sort of questions can I be asking of my data? What are some of the evidence-based strategies that we can sort of look at and move towards as we move forward? So starting with street outreach, we have three primary measures that we looked at across these studies, and we're presenting the data in sort of a three-tier. So you'll see this across all tiers, which is one, there is sort of foundational data, which is sort of the lower end of the performance spectrum from what we saw from high performing organizations. Two will be sort of a target measurement, which is much more of what we see as sort of the average or very common within high performing organizations. And then we have a stretch, which is what I would consider to be like the really, really high performing organizations are more sort of outlier in terms of their performance. What are they able to achieve? So first and foremost, we looked at successful exits from street outreach. That sort of foundational was 30% of clients are able to receive a successful exit from street outreach. Two, the target range was about 35%, and the stretch was around 40%. Successful exits from street outreach were really defined as being able to move along to the next level of care or what would be appropriate for that client. So, looking at things like exits to emergency shelter, transitional housing, permanent supportive housing, or even rapid rehousing. Any of those categories would be determined to be a successful exit in street outreach. So, are we moving people beyond their initial sort of living situation when they started street outreach? 2 was looking at the average length of participation in the street outreach program. We see the foundational sort of target as 272 days, which is around 8 months, I believe. So a very long-term participation that is very sort of focused on building trust, promoting autonomy, and really building a relationship with the population that we typically see through street outreach. The target was set at 217.5 days, so about 6 to 5 months in street outreach. And then we saw like the really, really high performing programs sort of hovering around 165 days, which is typically, I believe, around 4 to 5 months of participation in that program. And then in terms of returns to homelessness, when they exited the program, did they exit or continue to experience homelessness? We saw sort of a foundational target, about 40% of clients would return to homelessness, the target at around 35%. And then the stretch goal, the really high achieving programs were able to achieve 30%. So when we reviewed these studies, we identified some evidence-based strategies for street outreach. First is just that it's very person-centered engagement. It's very individualized. It's really placing that individual at the sort of nexus of care and really promoting their ability to sort of make decisions and have autonomy around where they go and what level of care they receive, and is really focused on relationship building. 2, for those high performing organizations in achieving housing outcomes, we saw that they were really embedded and strong participants in coordinated entry. So when they were forming those relationships, capturing that initial data, those individuals were put into coordinated entry, completed the intake process, and were placed on that list of how can we get this person into a higher level of care or a more appropriate sort of place to be able to receive housing. And 3 is that the best street outreach programs were typically really, really closely partnered with a permanent housing program. So, really working in close partnership with rapid rehousing, permanent supportive housing, etc. So, you can really see that the housing outcomes are typically street outreach is a really vital tool on that front end to be able to capture those clients, understand, and get them embedded within the housing processes that exist, including coordinated entry or close partnerships with other organizations that do provide housing assistance. Emergency shelter. So for emergency shelter, we looked at exits to permanent housing from emergency shelter. What was the average length of participation within emergency shelter programs? And then when they exited from emergency shelter, were they returning to homelessness? That foundational target for exits from emergency shelter to permanent housing was around 30%. The target was 40%, and that stretch was 45%. I will say that this is one of the more higher variability measures that we looked at. Some shelters we saw in the studies had a very low sort of percentage conversion to permanent housing. We saw in higher performing programs, this number may even be higher than the percentages we listed here. We sort of calibrated our measure down to what we saw most frequently, but I will note that this is pretty high variability and was typically determined by what other resources that emergency shelter had, such as rapid rehousing dollars or other forms of assistance they could provide. In terms of the average shelter stay before entering permanent housing, we saw that foundational target really set at 150 days of participation. We looked at target of about 120 days, and then that stretch of about 90 days being sort of the quickest turnaround, that sort of 3 month timeline of being really able to connect people to permanent housing, either through rapid rehousing or other assistance. And then when we looked at how often are people in emergency shelter exiting to homelessness, we saw that foundation being at around 40%, the higher performing target of 35%, and really that stretch goal of around 30% of clients would return to homelessness. So we do see some effectiveness within emergency shelter of being able to move people to permanent housing. And we saw a number of strategies that really helped sort of inform those outcomes. First is really embracing that housing first philosophy of permanent housing being the cornerstone of transformative change and really being the prioritized goal for any services those clients do receive, was always really focused on getting them to be able to achieve permanent housing placement. Two is that emergency shelters that were successful were typically low barrier, that they don't have a lot of restrictive requirements that sort of funnel folks out of shelter or make shelter not a viable option for them. And then three, we really saw that housing focused rapid exit services were really important. So really looking at maximizing the available resources to focus on swiftly connecting those individuals to permanent housing solutions and then coordinating wraparound care once they were placed in permanent supportive housing or a permanent housing placement with assistance. Next, we looked at rapid rehousing. So we looked at what were the exits from rapid rehousing to permanent housing, what was the average length of participation in the rapid rehousing program before being placed in that housing, and then what were the exits looking like from rapid rehousing to homelessness. So for exits to permanent housing, we saw a foundation of about 65% of clients who entered the program were able to achieve some level of permanent housing. The target, we saw 75%. And then for the really high performing programs, we saw 80% of clients that entered into rapid rehousing ended up securing a permanent housing placement. In terms of how long they participated in the program, we saw a foundation of around 90 days. And you will recognize that the emergency shelter sort of stretch target was 90 days. We saw that rapid rehousing was a very effective tool to get people placed into housing very quickly, with the target goal being around 60 days, and that sort of stretch goal being even as low as 30 days spent in the program before actually entering the permanent housing placement. In terms of exits from rapid rehousing to homelessness, we saw a foundation of around 15%, the target at around 13%, and then the stretch goal being at around 10%. In terms of what sort of evidence-driven strategies were rapid rehousing programs leveraging, we saw that permanent housing was always the goal. It was the number one priority to get folks housed as quickly as possible because further engagement, outreach, and supportive services were always sort of calibrated around getting them into housing and then wrapping around for sort of housing stability supports once placed. Two is we saw what is called by the National Alliance to End Homelessness progressive engagement. So really person-centered strategies to sort of calibrate what do they need to achieve housing, what do they need to sustain housing. So it wasn't a rigid program that really targeted specific things. It was very calibrated to the individual needs of that person on what they would need to sort of be able to achieve and then sustain housing. And then three, we saw high performing programs often had very strong relationships with landlords and were very intentional about building those relationships because rapid rehousing exits are really reliant on being able to find market rate housing. So being proactive and intentional about building those relationships was a really critical tool to ensure that those dollars were able to be spent down and ultimately people were able to achieve permanent housing from there. Permanent supportive housing, we really had two metrics. So the first one was really looking at successful placement in permanent housing. And then we were able to look at how long were those people able to sustain that permanent supportive housing placement. I will say this is probably the area with the most robust evidence set because there's been a really large investment by foundations, private funders, and the federal government in terms of being able to study and demonstrate outcomes. So we see the foundation for successful placement being around 80%. So if there is an individual with high needs that would qualify for the permanent supportive housing program, they would typically turn around and have 80% successful placements. The target was a little increased to 85%. And then for really, really high performing programs, we saw 95% of clients were able to successfully secure a permanent supportive housing placement. In terms of their ability to sustain that placement, we saw really promising data in terms of around 70% were able to sustain that placement for at least 24 months or 2 years. We saw a target of around 80% of those clients were able to sustain housing for a long time, and then a stretch of 90%. So the highest performing programs were able to keep 90% of their clients in housing through 2 years. So how did they do that? First and foremost is that there's a low barrier to entry. It's really meeting clients where they are and securing the ability to convert them into a permanent supportive housing placement. Two is that there were minimal requirements for programmatic engagement. So there weren't a lot of strings attached. There were not mandatory participation in supportive services like behavioral health care or substance use treatment or anything of that nature. There were minimal requirements. It was often very sort of driven by the needs of a particular client that were placed in permanent supportive housing. And then just to really drive that home, we saw that supporting services were prioritized. It was not housing only. There were a number of wraparound services that were available to those clients. And we saw that when it was voluntary, that the vast majority of clients did end up participating in supportive services, even though it was not mandatory. Next, we looked at transitional housing. So two metrics here is really what were the successful exits from transitional housing to a permanent housing option. And then we looked at what was the average length of participation in transitional housing before exiting. The foundational goal really being about 80% of transitional housing clients were able to transition from that housing into a permanent housing option, whether that be a market rate unit, a subsidized unit, or a different permanent housing option. The target was around 85% of clients were able to secure permanent housing. And then we had a stretch goal of around 90%. So really high performing programs were able to move the vast majority of their clients into some form of permanent housing placement. In terms of the length of participation, this was another one that was highly variable and is really shaped by the services that were offered at the transitional housing site. But we did see a foundation of around 36 months or 3 years in that transitional housing program, a target of around 2 years of participation in the program. And high performing programs were able to achieve as low as 12 months in the transitional housing program before moving on to a permanent housing option. Some evidence-driven strategy for transitional housing we noted was that permanent housing navigation was a priority. It was not really, from day one, it was an option of what is the permanent housing outcome that we are wanting to achieve with this client and what would be the most appropriate based off of where they're at and what they're sort of looking for. Two is that there was a flexible length of stay. So it wasn't necessarily that all clients are going to stay for the maximum amount of time allotted in the program. It was really geared towards what are the specific needs of the client. And then three, we saw successful transitional housing programs providing very holistic service in terms of things like financial wellness, health wellness services, employment, income, and financial stability level services were often very paired in and part of the larger programmatic model of those transitional housing programs. Bridge housing was another component we looked at. So OHI has suggested that we sort of go over what bridge housing is defined as. So we really looked at a temporary housing option where those folks have a permanent housing resource, either through coordinated entry or a different referral source. So they have housing, but there's a gap between when that housing starts and when they were offered that housing. It could be a number of months, it could be a few weeks. Bridge housing is typically that interim solution to sort of keep those folks housed so they could avoid experiencing homelessness and could successfully enter their permanent housing option that they have secured. So there are a number of things that qualify under the bridge housing model, but we did see that a lot of those programs would offer supportive services, case management, and often connections to healthcare in some capacity, including physical, behavioral, or mental health care along the way. In terms of measures for bridge housing, this is by far the least developed area, I'd say, of evidence of the programs we looked, because it is a relatively unique program in terms of Colorado is one of sort of the trendsetters in being able to offer bridge housing support. But we did find studies that looked at what was called interim housing that served a very similar function. So we looked at the percent of successful placements in permanent supportive housing or other market rate permanent housing. And we saw a foundational target of around 90%, a target level of 95%, and then a stretch goal of 100% conversion, which I would say makes sense in context of that person has already secured a permanent housing option. They have it ready. They just need a time before their lease starts or they're able to actually enter that program. So the evidence suggests that there's a very high target for that conversion because those folks are already entering the program with a permanent housing option really high up on their plate. They just need something in the interim to be able to avoid experiencing homelessness in the short term. Finally, we looked at eviction prevention. So we really looked at the evidence base for eviction prevention is much more developed. I will say that homelessness prevention is a more of a area that has A, less research around it, but B, is fastly developing. So we did not include that in our analysis because we weren't able to find a lot of really high quality evidence around what homelessness prevention looks like. But we do know from eviction prevention, there are there are two primary sort of strategies that are utilized to avoid eviction. The first one being pre-proceeding interventions. So before you even get to the eviction proceeding, being able to sort of offer services, mediation, and navigation support. We saw around 50% sort of avoidance of having the case dismissed or settled, which would mean they would not have an eviction on their record and they might have additional time to secure other housing. So they're able to avoid eviction. We saw a target of around 60%. And then we saw for the highest performing programs, we saw around a 70% success rate at getting cases either settled or dismissed entirely. The other bucket of services we saw were really legal representation. So cities and municipalities have started providing legal representation for folks in eviction proceedings. And we saw that 8% of cases with positive outcomes, AKA the eviction was dismissed or they were able to secure housing through another modality, being around 60% of cases for foundation, the target being around 70%, and then the stretch goal of really high performing programs, really achieving a positive outcome in about 80% of the cases they had. And then finally, we looked at the percentage of cases where housing was immediately maintained. So they were able to stay in their housing. We saw around 50% of cases were able to secure and maintain their housing, a target of around 65%, and then really high performing programs hitting a 75% mark. So we did see that these interventions could be quite successful, but it's important to note that they were often paired with things like rental assistance, flex funds, other things that were able to be leveraged to secure that housing. So in terms of homelessness and eviction prevention, it was often very holistic and there were a variety of programs that were provided.
Hey, Colin, can I just add
Mhm.
one piece there? There has been some
Absolutely.
really interesting research. I'll put the link in the chat recently around randomized control trials for homelessness prevention. We specifically didn't include those here because these programs are looking at giving direct cash assistance to people, which is often not possible with the funds from the state and federal government. So, to Colin's point, there's a lot of really varied research out there. They're doing some really cool work around randomized controlled trials and figuring out exactly what does prevent homelessness and how. Unfortunately, a lot of the funds that we're talking about through Thor or HRP or the COC funds can't be used in that way. So we didn't include that here, but I popped the link in the chat. It's a great read if you're a policy wonk like me and Colin.
Awesome. Thanks, Cassie. So before we move on to Matt, are there any sort of questions about any of the national data we presented today, or anything you all thought was particularly useful, meaningful? Any questions it raised for you? All good. We'll move on to Matt, but I'm always around if you have questions or want to learn more. We'll send out sort of a full guide to this research with full citations in a follow-up email. So be looking for that within the next few days. But for now, I'll pass it over to Matt and he'll take over presenting his slides.
Awesome. Thanks, Colin. I'll start sharing my screen. Can I get a quick thumbs up, maybe an emoji, people seeing this okay? Wonderful. Well, I am Matt Richard. It is lovely to see so many familiar names on the meeting today. I've been in the space in one way or another since 2014 when I was on the Volunteers of America's SSVF, or Supportive Services for Veteran Families team. I moved over to the Metro Denver Homeless Initiative in 2018 to join their HMIS lead agency for the Metro Denver COC. And then in 2023, I shifted over to the Division of Housing here at the Colorado Department of Local Affairs to become the Balance of State COC's HMIS manager. And as Summer mentioned on the front end of the meeting, over the next few months, I am sliding into a new position as Homeless Systems Data and Reporting Manager. Well, I'll really be supporting state-funded investments that use co-HMIS to help demonstrate the impact that our efforts are having to help standardize our approach to the dashboards and reports and evaluation and data quality resources that we have available. So I'm grateful to be in this space with you all today and go over some of the resources we currently offer right now. So why did we build these co-HMIS dashboards? Well, friends, we really wanted to move beyond the default reports and analyses HMIS and HUD are usually associated with. So think like APRs or CAPERs, or initiatives like the annual point in time count, which represents those experiencing homelessness on a single night. And we wanted to move toward leveraging our statewide HMIS, which is used year round, to try to support a clearer understanding about the extent of homelessness across Colorado and our response system. We wanted to help better represent the scale and characteristics of those receiving services and really shine a light on, the disparities and inequities that we know are present among the folks that we serve. We wanted to use the data that we have access to help tell the story about our efforts and outcomes and really create something that providers can get a tangible product for. They see the larger efforts that they're contributing to at a statewide level, but also can apply filters and very quickly get a resource that's customized for their agency or their specific projects. And we want to use all the insights from these resources to help inform the public and policymakers and move toward more data-driven investments and equitable service delivery. In a nutshell, that's kind of why we've started building out the dashboards that we offer. So before I get into the dashboards we're going to highlight today, we wanted to go over some important distinctions or differences between the way that HUD arrives at breakdowns in their reports and the way that the co-HMIS lead agencies across the state have approached the work on our side. So starting with HUD, really the logic and metrics in those HUD reports are defined by them. We can't customize what they are. They just are what they are, right? There's a place and time for them for federally funded projects. They're really more reflecting participants with overlapping enrollments within the reporting period. So think like project start dates or project exit dates. And one way or another, those folks overlapped with the reporting period you're running them for. Those reports are available to be run within our HMIS on demand, but the ability to run those reports is limited to end users of our system. And they are designed primarily around federal compliance and reporting requirements. So shifting gears a bit on the co-HMIS side of the shop, the metrics that we create are a little bit more flexible. They're more customizable. We can work together with our providers and with our state and local funders to define our own performance metrics. In the breakdowns that we'll go over today and that are available in the dashboards we have available, we really try to reflect participant activity with more targeted criteria. And I've linked a resource in here that I'll cover a piece of today, but we encourage folks to take a look afterwards. It's really trying to provide transparency and documentation around the nuts and bolts of how we're arriving at breakdowns in our custom dashboards. And unlike the reports that are available within HMIS, access to the dashboards that we have created are really available to any staff member at a co-HMIS participating agency. So if your agency participates with our system, even if you yourself do not have a login, you can still have access to the dashboards that we've created. And I'll go over how to request access toward the end of my portion today. We've really tried to support both HUD needs and local funder and provider priorities in the reports and dashboards that we've been leaning into. It's not that one is more important than the other. It's just there's an and there. There's a both and there that we've tried to thread the needle for. So I won't get too into under the hood in the calculations and specific nuts and bolts that go into our calculations, but I do think it's important to go over our served during the period calculation, which is at the heart of all of the reports that we have available to folks. We're really, again, identifying participants who were active during a reporting period based on details like their HMIS project type, their enrollment dates, and additional dated or qualified activities we look for in those enrollments. So we split this into two main categories: entry-exit projects and activity-based projects. Entry-exit-based projects are really, entry-exit emergency shelters or transitional housing, safe haven, homelessness prevention, permanent housing, including permanent supportive housing, rapid rehousing, and other permanent housing. Based on expected workflows for these project types, we really should only need to look at enrollments where those project start dates or exit dates are overlapping with the reporting period. If you have enrollments that overlap with the reporting period, we should be able to safely infer that these people were served and active during that reporting period. When we go over to activity-based projects, this includes things like coordinated entry or street outreach or night-by-night emergency shelters or day shelters or supportive services only. These are projects where, regular or timely exits may not be happening based on workflows or based on people intermittently presenting and receiving services in those spaces. So for these project types, we really look for those dated qualified activities in the reporting period before we bring in participants in our breakdowns. So examples are project start dates and exit dates, status updates, annual assessments, current living situations, or services. We're really trying to be more targeted before bringing in breakdowns for those project types, so we don't accidentally report inflated numbers of people being served. As a quick example of that, just like focusing on the balance of state continuum of care, the portion of our statewide system our team is responsible for. When we look at calendar year 2025, January through the end of October, if we just look at overlapping enrollments, that's around 10,336 folks. When we look at our more targeted co-HMIS criteria using that served during the period methodology I was referencing, it's 9,963. So that's a difference of about 375. It's not a huge difference. When we look at this at a statewide level, though, that difference can quickly get up above 10,000. So when we think about reports that we are putting out there to our providers or to the general public, like with our state of homelessness report that we all collaborated on and released last year, it's really important to all of us and in the different COCs, and I'm sure all of you, to make sure as much as we can, we're reflecting data-driven numbers of people and households accessing services. So just want to go over a little housekeeping on my side before I got into sharing the dashboards themselves. We're going to primarily focus on the statewide dashboards that we have available today. These are available at our shared CoHMIS website, cohmis.org/agency. And this is really all of the HMIS leads' first attempts to demonstrate that statewide impact with the ability to still see COC by COC or agency by agency or even project by project. The key performance indicators that are things we wanted folks to have accessible at their fingertips. So I'll kind of go into each of these a little bit. Each page has instruction overlays. You can click a button, you can open those instructions, and you can kind of get some call outs that you can navigate to different dashboard pages. You can choose different reporting periods. You can apply optional filters, and then we have a lot of interactivity baked underneath the hood too. You can hover over visuals for tooltips or definitions. This work is homeless services and data collection for homeless services is very nuanced. There's a lot of jargon that gets tossed around. So if you're immersed in HMIS every day, the way that I am, the way that my colleagues are, we kind of take for granted some of those terms. We've tried to make sure we have definitions and hover over tooltips for folks who might just be a layer removed viewing these breakdowns. Going over the layout overview just a little bit too, you can navigate between the pages at the top of each dashboard. You also get a description of what you're looking at when you're on these dashboards, right? The people and households served, we're really looking at people and households who have those enrollments that overlap with the reporting period that's been selected, with the caveat that that is also incorporating those more activity-based criteria for the project types we discussed. And then you can change that reporting period selector. Most of these dashboards have a pretty standard look and feel in terms of the KPIs that are available, right? People, households, household types, people being served per project type. If we move over to the new enrollments page, kind of same layout, right? Except this one is focusing on people who are having new project start dates in our system. For the balance of state COC, which all of these visuals are filtered down for, month over month so far this year, we have 770 people getting new enrollments in all of the project types you see on the right. For housing placements, this one's focusing on the number of people and households who are receiving housing move-in dates entered within their enrollments in the system during the reporting period. We can see month over month the numbers there for rapid rehousing, permanent supportive housing, or other permanent housing. And I think this dashboard is great at celebrating, the new housing placements that are happening. But I think where we have some opportunity on our side is there are roughly 12,600 people across roughly 9,000 households who are actively enrolled in permanent housing projects in Colorado. Of those folks, 86% are currently in housing. And when you look at the folks in permanent supportive housing, that's about 6,300 people. Of those 6,300 people, 95% are residing in housing based on those that participate in HMIS. I think those pieces are important to call out and to build dashboards around. And it's not just new things. It's not just who was served during the period. It's trying to have that more real-time insights lens too, right? The active numbers on who is being served where and what impact those projects are having for folks. And then on the last page that's currently available on the statewide dashboards are the exit outcomes. So based on the project exit dates that are being entered within the selected reporting period, the number of people exiting each of these project types and the percentage that are exiting to housing or these other destination options. So trying to evaluate, more at the project type level here before filters are applied, how these different interventions are doing at ensuring folks are exiting to housing. I think this is another one where exit outcomes don't tell the whole story either, particularly for permanent supportive housing. There's only been 130 exits for that project type, and 44% for the balance of state are to housing. That's because the bulk of those people are still actively enrolled. They're still in the housing that's been secured for them. And I think that's kind of some of the pieces we're hoping to lean into more on iterative dashboard build-outs and reports that we create. Each page also has demographics and additional characteristics. So providers have the ability to really get a one-pager for whatever the page is they're looking at and see everything through that kind of the equity prism that's available, right? the Black, Indigenous, and people of color, race and ethnicity, Hispanic, non-Hispanic details, gender, age tiers, chronically homeless veterans, and those who've reported disabilities. When we look at our available filters, you can choose your agency. You can select specific projects, and all of the filters that you apply on these dashboards will follow you across all the rest of the pages too. So you don't have to reapply filters after you apply them once. Now, I do want to cover that there are millions of records associated with this statewide data source that these statewide dashboards are built off of. There's a lot going on behind the scenes, so we can reflect that more data-driven approach for the number of people and households with active criteria. I want to go over some tips and tricks for how, if you needed to apply multiple filters, maybe you wanted to change the reporting period, or you wanted to apply filters for your specific agency, or maybe specific projects within your agency, there are ways at the bottom of the dashboard where you can actually click pause automatic updates. You can then add all of the filters that you want to add. And then when you click pause auto updates again, it'll resume everything. And it prevents the dashboard from having to load results between each and every filter that you've applied, which helps with performance and load times. So there's a lot underneath the hood. We just want to go over some easy ways to not have to wait for things to crunch through and process. And if you are a regular dashboard user, you find yourself going to these pages, or you think that you might in the future, there are ways that you can save what are called filter views. And filter views allow you to basically apply a set of filters and save them. So when you go back to the dashboard, you can load those filter views and not have to go through the steps of applying them one by one again. So at the bottom of each dashboard, you'll see this Save Custom View option that appears after you've applied filters. When you click that, you get a pop-up box where you can then give that filter view a name. So I created one on my end to monitor the continuum of care funded projects in the balance of state. I can even check that box, make it my default, if I wanted this dashboard to always load that filter view for me when I come back and load it. And if you click Save, it will then save that view for you to be accessible anytime you access the dashboards thereafter. So to access Save filter views, instead of clicking Save Custom View, you click the View section, and then that will load all of the filter views that you have available, and you can click them to pop between them and kind of see the different filter views kind of automatically applied for you. So those are the statewide dashboards. The other dashboards we're going to highlight today are the Transformational Homelessness Response, or THOR dashboards. And these, they mirror the Serve During the Period approach we went over for statewide, but they're designed more for our THOR-funded providers here at DOLA. And quick shout out to our friends at West Mountain Regional Health Alliance who volunteered to let us use them as the example in the overview. So there's 2 pages in these dashboards. The overall aggregate breakdowns, and then kind of more the row level by THOR program type and program name KPIs. I want to call out, when we were talking about HUD reports versus co-HMIS reports, HUD defines their project types the way that they define them. They are what they are. We cannot change those. For THOR, working with the THOR team here at DOLA, we're able to kind of reclassify the project types or project names that correspond to the THOR-funded program types. So bridge housing, for example, is not a default HMIS project type. We generally use entry-exit emergency shelter for those because that most closely aligns the intervention type and the workflow. Eviction and homelessness prevention, we reframe a little bit. We also have systems improvement in the mix too. So just kind of flagging an area of opportunity that our statewide dashboards have that the APRs and CAPRs just do not. When we look at core functionalities of the THOR dashboards, by default right now, when you load them, you'll have page navigation at the top, just like you do with the statewide dashboards, but you'll also have the reporting period that you can update. We try to default that year to date through the end of the most recently completed quarter for THOR reporting needs. And then you can apply your THOR-funded agency name. Everything kind of shows you everything about everything for THOR when you load things. And then you kind of pick your agency name to then see your specific breakdown. So again, thank you to West Mountain Regional Health Alliance. When we apply their agency name, we get breakdowns to reflect their portion or their Thor awards in the dashboards here. So kind of like a one size fits all on the front end that you then filter down for just your agency and award. And then this is true for the statewide dashboards too, but these dashboards allow you to download them as PDFs or PowerPoints for your own needs, right? The Thor team asks funded providers to download these PDFs and to send them to them after each quarter has come and gone. So you click the download icon at the bottom of the dashboard, you'll select PDF. You then get a pop-up where you select specific sheets from this workbook. You want to select all to get all of the pages in the workbook. You pick unspecified for your paper size, and then you click download, and you get a nice packaged PDF that you can share with the Thor team or that you can use internally for whatever organizational needs you might have around these projects. So in terms of requesting access to the dashboards we have available, and these are the two that we've highlighted, each COC is kind of doing different things right now to support local initiatives. In the balance of state, we have some region-specific dashboards we're coming online with. You would submit your co-HMIS Tableau Cloud end user agreement, which is linked in the slide deck that'll go out. And submitting these Tableau Cloud end user agreements generates a ticket to your HMIS lead agency, who will review and approve, assuming that you work for an agency with the co-HMIS agency partnership agreement on file. That's not limited to end users of the system. It's anybody that works at your agency. Maybe you have folks who are more at the operational level, less involved with data entry, who still have a need to access and have eyes on these dashboards. Logins are created for each approved user individually, so we don't allow shared logins. And that's primarily because of multi-factor authentication or two-factor authentication, where you have both a username and a password, but you also have to use a dedicated authentication application. That can be your local machine's password or a dedicated app like Google Authenticator or Microsoft Authenticator. So we're working with row-level data in our data sources, and we want to make sure that these are, things are being accessed in a secure fashion. That's the way the world is moving around data security too. Two-factor authentication is just kind of best practice here. In terms of our reporting roadmap, and then that's we can kind of open it up and see what questions there are, or if there's any desire for any demos. We're working right now at the co-HMIS lead level to really lean into supporting data quality and data timeliness resources. The same way we've tried to move beyond the HUD reports like APRs and CAPRs to see those total people being served, we want to move beyond HMIS data quality reports or the data quality sections on APRs and CAPRs to show in more targeted ways how data quality is looking across the entire system by specific project type, by agency, by specific project, and potentially by even specific end user, right? Really helping us inform maybe some training needs or some support that we can provide. And I think data timeliness is another really crucial piece too, particularly for interventions like outreach and coordinated entry, where, having timely, accurate details for care coordination purposes is so critical. Having data that isn't timely or that isn't accurate can impact eligibility and opportunities for resources. So we really want to support those efforts. We're also working hard to develop more shared definitions and documentation, like the one that I linked earlier in the presentation. This shouldn't be like a Wizard of Oz situation where there's a guy behind a curtain doing a bunch of stuff that nobody understands. We want to have people have insights into how we're arriving at breakdowns and have those be accessible and available for folks who are interested in reviewing. The HMIS leads across the state are also going through a strategic planning effort right now. And we're really working to standardize our approach as much as we can, along with our funders here at the state and in each COC, to try to have that standard way that we evaluate and monitor performance, the key performance indicators that we are looking at, and the metrics that are important to help us kind of measure that impact. And then we also want to lean into advanced functionalities of the tools that we have available, and improving our data infrastructure, improving our ability to refresh this large data source more frequently. Or when instead of when you log in, having to apply filters for your agency, those things just automatically happen for you based on user permissions for the agency that you work for. Or imagine where you don't have to log in and download PDFs for your Thor awards. Those just automatically get scheduled to your email at the end of the quarter. Things like that are features that we are hoping to leverage. And then certainly expanded access to this information. I would encourage folks who don't have access to the dashboards we've covered today, use that Tableau Cloud end user agreement. Sign up for access to these things, and give us feedback about the current resources too, and things you'd like to see. We also want to expand access to more front-facing iterations of this work, right? Maybe tailored slightly differently, but informing the general public and policymakers, and really using our data to be advocates, to shine a light on the need in our communities, and in the times that we're in, hopefully be a little bit of a call to action for care coordination too. So those are the high level pieces I had to go over with today. I'm happy to open it up for questions, or see where folks might want to discuss.
Thanks so much, Matt. That was really helpful and very insightful. Want to check in if anyone has questions, raise your hand, put something in the chat box. We're here for it.
It's not really a question, it's more of a request. Since we do have a little bit of time and we are running early, Matt, do you mind doing a quick demo? Not to put you on the spot, but just to sort of show folks and get in the recording, like the functionality of the system itself.
Totally. Let me pop to our shared website. This is a good plug for our statewide state of homelessness report from last year. All 4 COCs contributed to as well. If you haven't visited this page or read this report, would encourage you to. We're excited to lean into the 2025 edition of this report soon as well. So this is the main page. I think before I get into the dashboard demo, I will call out a definitions page since we have some time too. Speaking of the jargon that we have in this space, our colleagues at the Metro Denver Homeless Initiative have really tried to call out, specific definitions associated with the dashboards and HMIS and HUD in ways that are hopefully kind of accessible and easy to understand, right? So you click and you can see that definition there. When we want to go to the statewide dashboards, we go to agency dashboard here. And this is where you do need that username and password and 2-factor authentication to log in. So I'll get that right now. It's giving me a pop-up box that you're likely not seeing in the way that I'm sharing my screen, but I'm entering my username and password. I personally use Google Authenticator. I find it's a pretty easy way to navigate the authentication requirements of Tableau Cloud dashboards that we built. And after I verify, should be redirected back to the page, and the dashboard will load for me. So for me, friends, I always like to go full screen at the bottom to load the dashboard up, but I want to call out too, like those abilities to download things, as PDFs or PowerPoints. I have kind of super user rights here, so I can download the Tableau workbook and play around underneath the hood if I needed to. If you wanted to pause automatic updates, let me kind of show you this in action, because I think this is an important detail that folks do not know about that really helps with performance. If I pause those automatic updates, I can go up here and maybe I want to look at, maybe I want to look at a handful of agencies. And I'm just going to pick some at random. I'll pick a handful here. And if I didn't pause automatic updates, it was going to crunch everything I'm doing before it would load results. So this gives me the ability to kind of like prevent that number crunching and just apply what I'm after, right? I've applied a number of agency names. Maybe I want to look at, maybe I want to look at all permanent housing project types here for those agencies. So I pop in, And maybe I want to also update the reporting period to be the end of October, not the end of September. I found an action item for myself after this meeting. So when I go back down, if I click resume auto updates, this is when all of the updates and filters I just applied are going to crunch. I don't have to wait after the other like I would have had to if I didn't do that. So it still takes a second, but then it's updated the dashboard dynamically to show me the number of people and households and other KPIs for each page that are reflective of the project types and agency names that I selected. Same, let me go full screen now that I've done that. I could also save that as a custom view, right? If I wanted to save this as like random agency name, make it my default, I could. I'll go full screen though. And this is where I can look at that instruction overlay, kind of get an idea of what is going on underneath the hood, navigate to those different pages, choose those dates, apply those filters. If I hover over the project types, for example, and this might be kind of tiny on Zoom right now, apologies. We have kind of some tooltips where you see both the people and the households that correspond to that project type, and then we define that project type too. And if you wanted to further filter this dashboard, you could click permanent supportive housing, and then everything will limit itself to the breakdowns for PSH, for people and households served too. If I uncheck that, it opens back up. So if I pop over to new enrollments, all of the filters that I have applied will follow me, right? All of those same agencies that I put in for all of those permanent housing projects. And the first time you navigate to each page, there will be a little bit of a loading time. But then I have, again, this is like not the statewide view, it is the agencies or specific filters I've applied that I indicated I was interested in. So for the random agencies I picked, for the permanent housing projects I selected, I see I have about 64 folks being served month over month, right? We can hover over and we can even filter on a specific month if we wanted to click and do that. Same with our household types. I know this is not always intuitive. This is in our definitions page on cohmis.org, but we've tried to define household types in ways that align with like HMIS and HUD and care coordination, right? Adults are households that contain folks who are 25 years of age and older, and that's it. There might be multiple adults in the same household who are 25 years of age or older, but there aren't any minor children present. Families are those that consist of at least one adult who's 25 years of age and older, and at least one child under the age of 18. So that's kind of the definition that we use there. And then youth would be that more encompassing look at youth and young adults, which consist of household members 24 years of age and younger. So that includes unaccompanied youth and parenting youth. And we can click to filter any of these household types too, and see all of the demographics associated with the filters that we have, the number of folks matching chronic homelessness based on their entry screen details, veterans, those that have reported disabilities, et cetera. I'm going to pop over to exit outcomes 2 here. And this one has an additional tooltip that some of the others don't, just given some of the nuance around exit destinations. In just a sec, this will populate for me. So we get the 3 project types that I've applied my filters for. And if I hover over any of these specific destination types, like housed exits, it will give you a pop-up that shows you the percentage of exits associated with that destination for this project type, the total number of people who exited, and the number of exits to each destination as well. So we get, rental by client with ongoing housing subsidy was the top destination associated with PSH for the filters that I have applied right now. And I can click and filter this further if I wanted to. Other outcomes, right? We can do this for all of the different outcomes to see what these different outcome categories are like. Unfortunately, folks in permanent supportive housing and in general in our work, folks pass away. That is one that we see in our data for sure. We see temporary exits, things like staying or living with friends on temporary tenure, places not meant for habitation. All of these details are available on these hover over tooltips too. So I think those would be the specific callouts that I would have for the dashboards for statewide. unless anybody has any questions or wanted to see anything specifically, or if there are any brave agencies who wanted to take a look at their portion of the breakdowns, maybe. If not, I will pop over to cohmis.org for the Thor provider version. All right, so same deal. This is where when you load this by default, it'll have every agency kind of listed that receives Thor funding. If I wanted to look at a specific agency, which I'll just keep using West Mountain since I have their permission, that's how I get my agency's kind of portion of the Thor impact that's happened. So, and then I can navigate between those two pages and see these specific details, not just the aggregates on page 1, but the specific projects on page 2 based on, the KPIs we currently offer for Thor funded. So served, enrolled, housing move-in dates, exit outcomes, and number of people exiting each program too. So I won't put West Mountain's information on blast in a recorded webinar, but they just want to call out the functionalities there too.
Does anyone have any questions or want to see Matt dive into something else specific or even redo something if he was going too fast? This is your moment. Get him while you've got him.
I guess I have a quick question.
Yeah, Seamus, what's up?
Hey, I'm curious about, and I could find this myself with some time, but the overlap you're seeing between dashboards for THR specific projects versus just the statewide collection of data regarding these project types. Are you seeing heavy correlation, or are there discrepancies based on the specific nuances of the THR funding?
Yeah, good question. So you mean are you asking about like the number of people that are Thor funded versus the larger that are statewide, Seamus, or like what's a specific
Yeah,
example?
I guess that could be one component I'm interested in, but also just the outcomes by like just statewide definitions of, you know, data outcomes that we're seeing in those THR projects versus just the national or statewide averages.
Yeah, totally. Totally. I mean, we can take a look. Now, let me do this for 1031. So that'll be on page 2 for the Thor Awards here. So this is going to be everybody. It's going to look a little scary on page 2 because it displays all of the project names until you apply a filter. But this is, I think, some of the additional opportunity we have is to not just look at things by project type or COC or agency, but by specific funding source too, right? So let me get past all the scary details here down below. And we can look at all Thor program types, rapid rehousing. So let's look at rapid rehousing and permanent supportive housing. So 69% for rapid rehousing. If we popped over to the statewide, we don't have a resource that does this in one place right now, Seamus, but I think that's like an area of opportunity that I definitely want to get to. So if I open up these filters here, let me pause. I do think that I think like rapid rehousing looks at a quick glance pretty consistent, like statewide or across the board as opposed to just Thor. Let me be talking and trying to do things at the same time. Difficult. Here we go. So I open things back up. This is all C. Well, let's do balance of state just for my portion that I'm responsible for. Click resume, and then we can look at rapid rehousing specifically. So this right now, you kind of have to go in two places, Seamus, to do what you're asking for. But I think this is a really great idea of like, hey, let's not just look at exit outcomes by the entirety of all exits for that project type, but how are different funding sources doing in their impact. So that's a great idea to build around.
And one of the reasons I guess I'm curious of that is due to the fact that there are specific programmatic requirements for THR that are a little more flexible than with other grant funding sources. So I would be curious to see how that impacts the outcomes that we're seeing in the data.
Yeah, totally. I have a new data source that's coming online right now that does have those funding source details available to kind of leverage and create breakdowns around. So right now, for the balance of state, we're at about 71% for folks exiting so far this year through the end of October. And I think as compared to Thor, it was about 69%. So pretty consistent on that piece. Yeah. Ways to get to details like that right now, Seamus, but definitely areas to, have more targeted resources available for. Same with the demographics, right? Like how is Thor versus like COC or HUD ESG, right? Like that's kind of the great thing about data and dashboards is being able to do those quick analyses right next to each other.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Matt, anything else that you want to share you think folks should know?
No, just gratitude for people's time today and excited to lean into some more of this work as we get into the new year. Welcome, always happy to do deep dives or connect one-on-one with folks as well if there are specific questions that occur after the fact. Definitely want to hear from providers doing the good work as we build things out as well. So.
Awesome. Well, thank you for your time today and for sharing your expertise with all of us. We really appreciate it. As Matt is sharing here on the screen, upcoming events, we've got in middle of December, How to Improve Outcomes Part 1. And then in January, we also have How to Improve Outcomes Part 2. So one focus is on program design and housing focus, and the other is on data and staffing. So you can click on the QR code there. It'll take you to a resource page. There was a question around whether we'd be sharing the slides and the recording from today. We will be. And so you'll be able to find that there on the resource page. Also want to ask everyone to take a few minutes to complete this survey. I just launched it, so you should be able to see it now. It just helps us ensure that we're staying on track and that we are kind of providing these types of virtual assemblies and learning circles that are meaningful and helpful to you. So if we need to go in a different direction, we can definitely do that. But we only know that if you tell us. So please take a few minutes to complete this. And there is a $5 gift card for one randomly selected person. This is when I should have music playing in the background. I can see the results coming in. So thanks everyone for taking a few minutes. We really appreciate it. And this is the wrap up of today's session. So I want to say thanks again to Matt. Thank you to Cullen. Thank you to Cassie for jumping in at times. Again, we really appreciate it. Once you're done taking the survey, you can go ahead and log off if you like. You can also find the survey